Hello there, Mandy here. Restorative Grief with Mandy Capehart is not just a podcast. It's also a book, a free online grief group, and a one-on-one private coaching practice. If you are interested in learning more, visit mandykapehart.com to find out how restorative grief can help you heal heart, mind, body, and spirit. Welcome back to Restorative Grief with Mandy Capehart. You are listening to episode 222, titled Defensiveness as a Grief Response: How Fear-Based Values Disrupt Connection. When we become defensive in conversation, it rarely feels like a choice. It rises up, quick, sharp, tightening the throat and curling our shoulders in. And it feels instinctual and necessary, like a shield we didn't realize we were carrying until someone's words strike and we hear the ring of impact. But when we are grieving, those instincts can cause more harm than protection. So this week, we are talking about how the values we assess in our grief work can help us to rebuild and heal our connections to self and others instead of resulting in defensiveness. In seasons of grief, whether grieving a person, a community, a belief, or a former version of ourselves, the instinct to be defensive and protect ourselves and our feelings is even more essential because we've already lost so much. The thought of losing one more piece, especially of who we believe ourselves to be, can feel unbearable. So we brace, we defend, we fight back, we try to preserve our sense of self because it feels like survival. But if that instinct keeps us isolated, misunderstood, or unable to evolve, then we need to ask what exactly we think we're protecting and whether the cost is connection. Understanding how we move through the world is not optional work if we want to be people who grow. Grief is a teacher that forces this awareness because loss strips away our illusions. We become more aware of what stays, what falls apart, and what we cling to out of fear rather than wisdom. We owe ourselves the honesty of noticing these patterns, not just the noble ones, but the inherited, imitated, trauma-built ones that once helped us endure. If those patterns no longer create connection or transformation, we have to acknowledge that even if they once served us, they may now be standing in our way. In relationships, these reflexive defensive responses can rupture long before we've realized we're protecting identity over intimacy. We retreat inward, clinging to a familiar version of ourselves because change feels like betrayal. When life has taken enough from us already, change can feel like loss, not growth. We protect the self we know because becoming someone else or someone new feels like another death. So I return to the question I can't seem to stop asking. Which version of you are you working so hard to keep alive? What part of you feels so essential that it can't be questioned, challenged, or refined? And if we examine that part closely, does it truly reflect your wholeness, or just an older self who got you this far when you knew less, had less, or were maybe feeling less loved? This isn't judgment, by the way, it's reverence. You are worthy of protection and care, but sometimes what we are protecting is not our truest self. It's the self we performed to stay safe. And those parts of us deserve compassion, but they also deserve rest. Writers talk about this phrase of killing your darlings, not because what we cut lacks value, but because the work needs space to become what it's meant to be. It needs editing, it needs refinement, and it needs us to let go of certain parts we might really think are necessary. The same is true for us internally. We hold parts of our identity sacred because they carried us through seasons of survival. But when the season changes, we are allowed to lay those selves down, not as rejection, but as benediction, as a burial with gratitude. Grief work is often this very thing, honoring the version of ourselves that belonged to a world that no longer exists. So when we refuse that internal editing, we risk clinging to fear-based values. Values formed in scarcity, harm, abandonment, or uncertainty tend to harden around protection, becoming certainty, suspicion, control, and avoidance. They teach us to love safety more than we love truth. They bind us to community through shared enemies instead of shared care. Fear-based values require threats to remain meaningful. And love-based values, curiosity, compassion, justice, belonging, they create room for relationship even when we disagree. They let us stay present long enough to be shaped by connection instead of shaped by fear. They allow identity to evolve without perceiving change as erasure. If you're unsure where your values sit, notice where you feel the strongest urge to defend. Which beliefs feel so essential that disagreement feels like betrayal? Which values feel like walls rather than invitations or open doors? The places we get most defensive are often the places where our grief still lives. Naming our values is only the beginning. Once named, we ask, how do these values shape the way that I love? Do they make me more tender or more armored? Do they help me stay or give me permission to withdraw? No value is pure because humans are contradictory, but honesty helps us discern whether a value is still protecting us or simply protecting our past. I can look back and name relationships I lost because I defended identity instead of connection, places where I loved being right more than I loved being in relationship. Those endings weren't always necessary. Some were simply moments I refused to soften when invited to grow. And that truth is uncomfortable, but it's also freeing. Parenting exposes this further. Many of my fear-based values were formed from wanting to protect my child from a world that feels too sharp. But protection rooted in fear can teach her that belonging is earned through vigilance. I want her to inherit values grounded in courage, care, and curiosity, not inherited fear. But to do that, I have to heal my own stories of harm so that I'm not handing her armor she doesn't need to wear. So all of us carry histories of betrayal, exclusion, silence, and abandonment. We formed those values in moments that saved us. Those younger selves did holy work, but their job was to get us here, not to define who we become or who we remain. So when conflict rises, whether with a parent, a friend, a community, or within ourselves, the question may not be, how do I defend who I am, but who am I becoming? And do I want this moment to shape me toward love or away from it? Not all conflict calls us to soften. Some asks us to remain firm. But much of the everyday relational tension we experience is not about danger. It's about discomfort, the unfamiliar invitation to grow. And maybe in that moment, where everything in us tightens and prepares to retreat, we can pause. We can notice the instinct without surrendering to it. We can stay just long enough to discern whether this moment is asking for protection or release, because we don't become more ourselves by clinging to who we've been. We become more ourselves by allowing who we are becoming to arrive and trusting that the parts we let go were never wasted. They finished their work, and we honor them by laying them down with love. Thank you for listening to episode 222 of Restorative Grief. Defensiveness is an easy and natural response, but the pause for curiosity and tenderness is a challenge worth taking. In my own life, I've had many humbling moments of recognizing my own defensiveness and taking a step away in order to check myself. It's been hard and so very healing for the grief I've carried, not to mention for the remaining relationships I want to preserve. If this episode resonates with you, I hope you'll subscribe, leave a review, and consider becoming a patron of the show. Thank you to each of my former and current patrons for the support you've offered over the years. With your investment in this work, the grief literacy continues to spread and change lives all over the world. And as always, before we go, one last thing. Please remember, the only solution for grief is to do the work of grieving. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week.